Every cold case has the same problem. Not a lack of evidence. Evidence exists. It always exists. The problem is that someone somewhere with enough money and enough power decided that the evidence was never going to see daylight. They paid the right people. They pressured the right editors. They made one phone call to one police captain, and the file was quietly reclassified, misfiled, or simply made to disappear. Hollywood has been doing this since before it had a name for doing it. The studio system was not just a machine for making films. It was a machine for making silence. It employed men whose entire job title did not appear on any company roster. Men who arrived at crime scenes before the police, who sat across from journalists with envelopes of cash, who explained to witnesses in very calm, very clear terms exactly what cooperation with the studio would mean for their futures. 15 cases. 15 moments where something real happened, and the full truth of what happened was buried with a thoroughness that took decades to even partially undo. We are reopening every single one of them today. These are the files that were never supposed to surface. This is the burial files. At number 1 is Judy Garland. This file does not begin with a single incident. It begins with a system. Judy Garland arrived at MGM as a child. She left it years later broken in ways that took the rest of her shortened life to fully manifest as a cautionary document about what the studio system was willing to do to a human being in order to extract maximum commercial value from that human being's talent. The documented facts are not disputed. They are simply not discussed with the directness they deserve. Garland was placed on amphetamines by studio doctors to control her weight and maintain her energy through punishing production schedules. She was placed on barbiturates to bring her down enough to sleep between those schedules. This pharmaceutical cycling, uppers during the day, downers at night, began when she was a teenager and established the addiction patterns that would define and ultimately end her life. The studio's legal and moral responsibility for this is not ambiguous. These are not decisions made by Garland or her family. They were decisions made by MGM's medical and production staff, sanctioned by studio executives who understood exactly what they were doing and calculated that the commercial return justified the human cost. Louis B. Mayer's direct involvement in the management of Garland's physical appearance and personal life, including documented accounts of his behavior toward her that go beyond professional oversight into something considerably darker, was known within the industry and protected by the studio's considerable power. Her 1969 death at 47 from an accidental barbiturate overdose was the final entry in a file that MGM had been trying to keep closed since the 1940s. The studio that built her into one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world spent decades managing the narrative of what it had done to her. The management was largely successful. The full accounting arrived slowly in memoirs written after the relevant executives were dead, in biographies published when the legal risks had expired. The people responsible for what happened to Judy Garland faced no professional consequences. They received industry awards. Some of them are still honored. The file remains, in terms of any formal accountability, completely unresolved. At number 2 is Jean Seberg. Jean Seberg was an American actress who became a French New Wave icon. Her performance in Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless in 1960 made her one of the most recognizable faces in international cinema. She was talented, beautiful, and, fatally for her, politically engaged. She donated money to the Black Panther Party and other civil rights organizations, and the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover noticed. What followed was not a scandal that Hollywood tried to erase. It was a scandal that the American government tried to create and that Hollywood's relationship with that government made possible. The FBI's COINTELPRO program, a covert operation designed to discredit political activists, specifically targeted Seberg. In 1970, the FBI planted a false story with a Hollywood journalist claiming that the father of Seberg's unborn child was a Black Panther leader. The story was false. It was a fabrication documented in FBI memos that were later released under Freedom of Information requests. The Los Angeles Times published it. Newsweek published it. Seberg went into premature labor 9 days after the story ran. The baby died 2 days after birth. At the funeral, Seberg opened the casket to show reporters that the infant was white, a public act of grief and rage that no person should ever have to perform. It did not matter. The damage was done. She suffered a breakdown. She never fully recovered. She attempted suicide on the anniversary of the baby's death every year for the rest of her life. In 1979, she was found dead in Paris in the back seat of her car 9 days after her disappearance. She was 40 years old. The FBI acknowledged its role in the COINTELPRO campaign against her. The acknowledgement came years after her death. No individual agent was disciplined. No formal accountability followed. The journalist who published the planted story expressed regret. The file on what the American government did to Jean Seberg, using the infrastructure of Hollywood publicity against her, is open and documented and has resulted in precisely nothing by way of consequence for anyone involved. And number 3 is William Desmond Taylor. February 1st, 1922, Los Angeles. A film director is found shot dead in his bungalow on Alvarado Street. His name is William Desmond Taylor, one of the most respected directors working in silent-era Hollywood. And from the moment the body is discovered, almost nothing about the investigation makes sense. Here is what the record shows. Neighbors heard what sounded like a gunshot the previous evening. At least one neighbor, a woman named Faith McLean, looked out of her window and reportedly saw a figure leaving Taylor's bungalow. She described the figure. Her description was vague enough to be useless and specific enough to suggest she knew more than she said. Here is what the record does not show. Any coherent police investigation, because before the detectives arrived, something extraordinary happened. Studio executives from Paramount, Taylor's employer, were on the scene. They were inside the bungalow before it was secured. What they touched, what they removed, what they rearranged in those critical first hours has never been established. What is established is that when the police did arrive, they were working a scene that powerful people had already processed. 3 women were immediately drawn into the investigation. Actress Mabel Normand, who had visited Taylor the evening of his death. Actress Mary Miles Minter, who was deeply infatuated with Taylor and whose letters to him were found at the scene, letters that destroyed her career the moment they became public. And Minter's mother, Charlotte Shelby, who had loudly and repeatedly threatened Taylor over his relationship with her daughter, who owned a gun of the caliber that killed him, and who was never seriously pursued as a suspect. The case was never solved. Shelby lived until 1957, 35 years after the murder, and never faced a formal charge. The studio's management of the early crime scene ensured that whatever physical evidence existed was compromised before any serious investigation began. Mabel Normand's career ended. Mary Miles Minter's career ended. The man who directed their films was dead, and the person most credibly linked to the killing died in her bed decades later in comfortable circumstances. The file is technically still open. It has been open for over 100 years. Nobody is actively working it. And number 4 is Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the constructed product of one of the most comprehensive image manufacturing operations in Hollywood history. Universal Pictures took Roy Fitzgerald, a shy, working-class young man with limited acting training, and built around him, brick by careful brick, the persona of Rock Hudson, the ultimate American masculine ideal. Strong jaw, easy smile, effortless heterosexual magnetism. The construction required concealment of the most fundamental kind. Hudson was gay. Universal knew it from the beginning, and Universal's solution was not to accept this as a fact about a human being in their employment. It was to manage it as a liability with all the cold efficiency that the studio system brought to every other production problem. The mechanisms of concealment were extensive and systematic. A marriage was arranged to his agent Henry Wilson's secretary, Phyllis Gates, in 1955 specifically to diffuse a confidential magazine story that was threatening to expose him. The marriage lasted 3 years. Its purpose was the protection of Universal's investment. Whether Gates fully understood what she was entering into has been debated. What is not debated is that the studio did. Hudson maintained the concealment for decades. He was a cooperative participant in his own erasure, understanding with a clarity that the legal and social environment of the 1950s made entirely rational that the alternative to concealment was the destruction of everything he had built. He gave interviews about his romantic life that were careful performances. He made films that required him to embody a heterosexual desire he did not feel. He was, in a very specific sense, acting every moment of his public life. He was diagnosed with AIDS in 1984. He publicly disclosed his illness in July 1985. And that disclosure, made as he was visibly dying, did more to shift American public awareness of the AIDS crisis than almost any other single moment. He died in October 1985. The studio that had spent 30 years manufacturing his public identity could not manage this final chapter and chose not to try. His file is one of the clearest documents available of what Hollywood's systematic concealment of homosexuality cost the human beings it was practiced on. At number 5 is Roman Polanski. In March 1977, Roman Polanski, one of cinema's most celebrated directors, the maker of Chinatown and Rosemary's Baby, was arrested at the home of actor Jack Nicholson and charged with the rape of a 13-year-old girl. He pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor as part of a plea agreement. Before sentencing, he fled to France and has not returned to the United States since. The facts of the case are not disputed. They are documented in court records, in the victim's own grand jury testimony, which she has subsequently allowed to be made public, and in Polanski's own admissions. This is not a he said, she said situation. This is a documented criminal admission followed by a documented flight from justice. What requires examination is Hollywood's response. In 2009, when Polanski was briefly detained in Switzerland on the basis of the outstanding American warrant, a petition was circulated in Hollywood calling for his release. It was signed by some of the most prominent figures in the industry: directors, producers, actors whose names represented the cultural establishment of American cinema. The petition described his detention as an extrajudicial measure and appealed for his release on the grounds of his artistic importance. The petition was eventually withdrawn by many of its signatories after the public reaction made the industry's position untenable. But its existence, the fact that it was assembled, circulated, and signed at all, documents something important about how Hollywood's power structures respond when one of their own faces accountability for actions that would result in immediate and permanent career destruction for anyone without their cultural standing. Polanski has continued making films from Europe. He has continued receiving awards from international film festivals. His victim, Samantha Geimer, who has shown extraordinary public grace in discussing her experience, has called repeatedly for the case to be dismissed, not because of what he did, but because the decades of legal process have been more traumatic for her than resolution. The Hollywood establishment's relationship with this case remains one of the most uncomfortable, unresolved documents in the industry's modern history. At number 6 is Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood drowned off the coast of Catalina Island on the night of November 28, 1981. She was 43 years old. The original cause of death was ruled accidental drowning. The case was reopened in 2011, then reopened again in 2018. The manner of death was changed from accidental to undetermined. As of today, it has not been resolved. Wood was aboard the yacht Splendor with her husband, actor Robert Wagner, and actor Christopher Walken, who had been filming a movie with Wood at the time. The events of that evening, what was said, what happened, what the sequence of events was that resulted in Wood being in the water, have never been established with certainty. Wagner has declined to answer specific questions under oath. The captain of the yacht, Dennis Davern, gave a statement to investigators that contradicted his original account, and that raises specific questions about what he witnessed. What the original investigation failed to do, and what subsequent reopenings have been unable to fully correct, is establish a clear timeline of that evening's events from people who were present and willing to speak completely honestly. The bruises documented on Wood's body at autopsy were noted and then explained away in the original investigation with a speed that the lead detective later publicly described as inadequate. That detective, Dwayne Razier, stated in later interviews that he believed the original investigation was insufficient. The case occupies a specific place in Hollywood's archive of unresolved deaths. Not definitively a covered-up murder. Not definitively a tragic accident, but a space of uncertainty that was allowed to form and solidify around a death that deserved more rigorous examination than it received. Why it did not receive that examination? Whether it was the deference that California law enforcement habitually extended to Hollywood's powerful or simple investigative failure, or something more deliberate, is itself an unanswered question. At number 7 is the Hollywood Blacklist. The Hollywood Blacklist is documented history. The period beginning in 1947, when the House Un-American Activities Committee began investigating alleged communist influence in the film industry, and when studios systematically fired, refused to hire, and destroyed the careers of writers, directors, and actors who were named as communist sympathizers. What is less often discussed is the specific human mechanics of how the blacklist operated. The informants who named names to save their own careers, the studio executives who enforced the blacklist while privately knowing that most of those named represented no actual security threat, and the specific individuals whose lives were destroyed by accusations that range from politically motivated to entirely fabricated. The most complete account of what the blacklist cost individual human beings is not in any official document. It is in the careers that simply stopped. Writers who had been producing important work, directors with bodies of work that should have defined their era, actors who disappeared from screens without explanation and without any public acknowledgement of why. Some cooperated, named names, expressed the required contrition, and returned to work. The shame of that cooperation, its betrayal of colleagues and friends, the specific human cost of buying one's own survival with someone else's destruction, is documented in memoirs that were often written decades later when the people named were dead or beyond further harm. Elia Kazan's cooperation with WAC and the way the industry subsequently both rewarded and punished him is one of the most complex moral documents in American cultural history. The studio's role was never truly reckoned with. They did not resist the blacklist. They administered it. They fired people whose guilt was unproven because the political cost of defending them was higher than the human cost of abandoning them. The executives who made those decisions received no professional consequences. The people whose careers and lives they destroyed are the ones who paid. At number 8 is Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge was the first African-American woman nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. Her performance in Carmen Jones in 1954 was a landmark moment in American cinema and in American cultural history. She was, by any measure, a performer of extraordinary gifts. She was also a black woman navigating an industry in a country that had very specific, very cruel ideas about what was permitted to a black woman of extraordinary gifts. The scandal that was used to damage her career did not originate with her. It originated with the hotel industry's segregation policies and with Hollywood's willingness to use those policies as a weapon. When Dandridge dipped her foot in a hotel swimming pool in Las Vegas, a pool she was not permitted to use as a black guest, the hotel's management drained and refilled the entire pool. The story was covered. It was meant to humiliate. The humiliation was a feature, not a bug, of a system designed to ensure that the boundaries of what a black actress was permitted remained clearly and publicly enforced. The studio system that nominated her for an Oscar simultaneously refused to cast her in the roles that her talent merited. Roles that went to white actresses of lesser ability, while Dandridge was offered parts that exploited her sexuality within the narrow space the industry had decided she was permitted to occupy. Her relationship with Otto Preminger, the director who had cast her in Carmen Jones and who exercised a controlling influence over her career and her personal life, was another dimension of exploitation that the industry protected because Preminger was powerful and useful. She died in 1965 at 42 from an accidental drug overdose. The industry that had failed to protect her from the racism that limited her career and that had allowed the men around her to exploit her in ways that a white actress of her stature would have been protected from, did not examine its own role in her destruction. It mourned her briefly and moved on. At number 9 is Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was in the middle of filming Casino Royale, the 1967 spy comedy spoof, when his relationship with co-star Orson Welles collapsed so completely that the two men refused to be on set at the same time. The producers were forced to film their scenes separately and edit them together. This fact is relatively well documented and has been discussed as a colorful piece of production chaos. What is less discussed is the broader pattern of psychological instability that Sellers experienced throughout his career. Episodes that were far more serious than the Casino Royale anecdote suggests, and that studios systematically concealed because the commercial value of Peter Sellers' functioning was too enormous to jeopardize with honest reporting. Sellers suffered a series of heart attacks in 1964 while filming Kiss Me, Stupid for director Billy Wilder. The production was shut down and Jack Lemmon replaced him. What followed was a period of genuine psychological crisis, paranoia, identity dissolution, a spiritual searching that those close to him described as a man who had lost his grip on who he actually was beneath the characters he inhabited. Sellers himself said in interviews of remarkable candor that he had no self, that the characters he played were more real to him than whatever existed underneath them. The studio's management of Sellers' instability was not compassionate. It was logistical. When he was functioning, they filmed. When he was not, they found workarounds. The human cost of being Peter Sellers, the specific psychological devastation of a talent that consumed its host, was treated as a production problem rather than a human crisis. He died of a heart attack in 1980 at 54. The full accounting of what the industry's demands had cost him was left to biographers working after his death with sources who no longer had careers to protect. At number 10 is Montgomery Clift. On May 12, 1956, Montgomery Clift left a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home in the Hollywood Hills, drove his car into a telephone pole, and was found by Taylor herself, who ran down the hill when she heard the crash, with his face destroyed. He had driven into a telephone pole on the winding road above Coldwater Canyon. The injuries required extensive surgery and left him with permanent nerve damage that changed his appearance and his ability to perform the facial expressions that had been the most precise instrument of his acting. The incident itself was not covered up. The crash was reported. What was covered up, or more precisely what was managed with the careful efficiency of the studio publicity machine, was the context. Clift was drunk. Clift was also in a state of psychological crisis that predated the accident and that his friends and colleagues were aware of. And Clift was navigating his own homosexuality in an industry in an era where its discovery would have been professionally catastrophic. The accident divided his career into a before and an after that was brutal in its clarity. The before was one of the most celebrated acting careers of his generation. A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, performances of extraordinary psychological precision. The after was a decade of declining health, increasing addiction, and work that was often brave, but produced in circumstances that compromised what he could deliver. What the studio system managed, and what MGM and Paramount invested in managing, was the narrative of a tragic accident rather than the fuller picture of a man in profound crisis who had received no institutional support. He died in 1966. He was 45. His housekeeper found him. He had been alone. At number 11 is Kim Novak. Kim Novak was Columbia Pictures' manufactured response to Marilyn Monroe, a blonde actress of genuine presence and underrated talent whom Harry Cohn, Columbia's notoriously controlling studio chief, treated with a possessiveness that went far beyond professional management into something considerably more disturbing. Cohn controlled Novak's appearance, her diet, her public movements, and her personal relationships with a thoroughness that she has described in interviews as total. When Novak began a relationship with Sammy Davis Jr. in the mid-1950s, a genuine romantic attachment between two adults, Cohn's response was to mobilize the studio's connections, including reported communications with figures of organized crime, to end the relationship. Davis subsequently married someone else within days under circumstances that those close to him described as coerced. The specific mechanics of how Cohn enforced his control over Novak's personal life, who made which calls, what was said, and to whom, were not reported at the time. The fan magazines printed stories about Novak's romances that bore little relationship to the reality of her life under Columbia's management. The journalists who knew more than they printed knew it because the studio had told them what they were and were not permitted to report. Novak has spoken in later interviews about the psychological damage of those years, the specific cost of having her personal life treated as studio property. She left Hollywood in the 1960s and has largely stayed away. What was done to her career and her personal autonomy by the system that simultaneously promoted and controlled her is documented in fragments, in her own words, in the gaps between what the studio said and what actually happened. At number 12 is Gene Tierney. Gene Tierney was one of the most beautiful women in Hollywood history. Her face was so precise, almost geometrically perfect, that it stopped conversation. Her performance in Laura in 1944 made her one of the defining actresses of film noir. She was a major star at 20th Century Fox, a woman whose presence in a film guaranteed a specific quality of attention. What happened to Gene Tierney in the early 1940s was not a scandal in the conventional Hollywood sense. It was a tragedy, one with a human villain who was never identified and never faced any consequence. During World War II, Tierney attended a United Service Organization's event and shook hands with hundreds of servicemen and women. One of those attendees was a female Marine who had recently broken quarantine while sick with rubella. She told Tierney this herself, told her she had broken quarantine specifically to meet her because she was such a fan. She apparently thought this was charming. Tierney was pregnant at the time. The rubella infection caused her daughter Daria to be born severely disabled, deaf, partially blind, and with serious developmental damage that required her to live in an institution for the rest of her life. The weight of this, the knowledge that her daughter's devastation traced back to a single handshake at a charity event, contributed to a psychiatric breakdown that required Tierney to undergo electroconvulsive therapy and lengthy institutional treatment. The studio managed the story of her breakdowns carefully, protecting her privacy in ways that were sometimes genuinely compassionate and sometimes motivated by the desire to protect their investment. The full story of what she endured and what it cost her was not publicly discussed until she wrote her memoir. The woman responsible for the original infection was never publicly identified. Tierney refused to name her even when she could have. That refusal, in the context of everything she had suffered, is one of the most extraordinary acts of grace in this entire archive. At number 13 is Clara Bow. Clara Bow was the original It Girl, the actress whose name became synonymous with a specific quality of electric, uncontainable feminine energy that the silent era and early sound cinema had never seen before. She was the biggest female box office draw of the late 1920s. She was also the target of one of the most sustained and deliberately constructed smear campaigns in Hollywood history. A series of stories beginning with a tell, all published by her former secretary, Daisy DeVoe, circulated claims about Bow's personal life that were lurid, specific, and in many cases demonstrably false or wildly exaggerated. Stories about her romantic life were amplified and embellished by a press culture that had built her up and was now engaged in the equally profitable business of tearing her down. What has been less examined is the specific role that Paramount Pictures played in the management of the scandal. The studio's interest in protecting Bow was real. She was generating significant revenue. But the studio's interest in controlling Bow was also real, and the boundary between managing her public image and actively deploying the scandal to bring a difficult, independent actress to heel was not clearly maintained. Bow suffered a serious nervous breakdown. Her sound film career never fully recovered. A combination of genuine anxiety about sound technology, the physical and psychological damage of the sustained public attack, and a studio that managed her decline more efficiently than it managed her crisis. She retired from films in 1931. She was 26 years old. She spent the next 30 years living quietly on a ranch in Nevada, largely avoiding the industry that had built her and then watched her burn. At number 14 is Lupe Velez. Lupe Velez was a Mexican actress of extraordinary energy and charisma. a genuine comic talent who Hollywood consistently underutilized in the Mexican Spitfire film series, while her actual range was never seriously explored. She died by suicide in December 1944 at her home in Beverly Hills at the age of 36. The manner of her death was reported with a fabricated dignity by the press. A story circulated and persisted for decades that she had been found drowned in her toilet, and that this undignified physical detail was the truth that the studio had tried and failed to suppress. This story, it appears, was itself a fabrication, a piece of posthumous cruelty invented to mock a woman who was not alive to defend herself. And that studio publicist may have circulated precisely because a story that made audiences uncomfortable with Valles was more useful than a story that made them examine what had driven her to this point. The actual facts of her death, that she had planned it carefully, that she had arranged her house with care and left letters for friends, suggest a woman in profound pain who faced her end with a specific kind of deliberate sorrow. She was pregnant. The father of the child, Harold Raymond, had declined to marry her. She had been managed throughout her Hollywood career by a system that valued her energy and her ethnicity as commercial properties while failing to provide her with roles or support proportionate to her talent. What the studio buried was not the manner of her death. It was the conditions of her life. The specific failures of an industry that used Lupe and never seriously invested in what she could have become. The posthumous indignity of the toilet story, whether studio planted or press invented, served the same function. It made her death about physical comedy rather than institutional failure. At number 15 is the studio pharmaceutical system. This final file does not have one name. It has hundreds. The studio system ran on pharmaceuticals. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. The physical demands of studio-era production schedules, the hours, the early calls, the 6-day weeks, the year-round production with minimal breaks, were incompatible with normal human sleep and recovery patterns. The studios knew this. Their solution was chemical. Studio doctors, men who were employed by the studios and whose primary loyalty was to production schedules rather than patient welfare, prescribed amphetamines for energy and barbiturates for sleep with a casualness that reflected their understanding of their actual function. They were not treating patients. They were maintaining production assets. The names caught in this system read like a roll call of Hollywood's golden age: Judy Garland, Barbara Stanwyck, Gene Tierney, Betty Hutton, Gail Russell, an actress of genuine beauty and talent who was given alcohol by studio personnel to manage her anxiety on set, and who died of alcoholism at 36. The pattern was so consistent, so systematic, and so thoroughly documented in the medical records that have subsequently become available that it cannot be described as individual tragedy. It was policy. What the studios buried was not any individual addiction story. They buried the systemic nature of what they were doing. Each breakdown, each hospitalization, each early death was managed as an individual narrative, a personal weakness, a private tragedy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame. The institutional cause, the deliberate chemical management of human beings as production resources, was never brought into focus while the people responsible for it were alive and in positions of power. They are gone now. The system they built is more visible in retrospect than it was in operation. The file on what Hollywood did to the bodies and minds of the people who generated its profits is the largest, the most thoroughly documented, and the least resolved file in this entire archive. Is the one that Hollywood has tried hardest to keep buried. 15 files. Every single one of them still open. That is the thing about buried cases. Burial is not the same as resolution. The studios that paid for the silence are mostly gone. The executives who made the calls are mostly dead. The journalists who took the money and printed the approved version of events have retired or passed on. And the truth, which was never as deeply buried as the people burying it believed, has been surfacing piece by piece for decades. What do we do with this information? We do not use it to simply feel superior to an era that we did not live through. We use it to understand the system, because the system did not end in 1970. The specific mechanisms have changed. The studio publicity machine operates differently now. The fixers use different tools. The money moves through different channels. But the fundamental transaction, the exchange of truth for power, the management of human lives as commercial properties, the burial of anything that threatens the investment, that transaction is not historical. Every one of these 15 files is a question, not just about what happened then, but about what is happening now that we will only fully understand in 30 years when the files are opened again. When the people who were silenced have found their voices or found historians willing to listen. The credits roll, the stars shine, and somewhere in a locked filing cabinet in a city built on the manufacturing of dreams, the real stories are waiting. They always surface eventually. This has been the Burial Files. Subscribe. Share this if one of these 15 cases stopped you cold. And tell us in the comments which file you think goes deepest, because these cases are not finished. Not one of them.